melt is when I'm ocean wave.
Today on Virginia Legends podcast, I have Tim Heaphy, partner of Willkie Farr and a white-collar defense attorney. My classmate, UVA class 91, maybe he's had the most interesting legal career of anyone at UVA class of 91. Tim, nice to see you. Thanks for doing this.
Julian, thanks a lot for having me. I appreciate it.
Oh, of course. Well, I'm going to try to give the broad sketches of your career because it's you've definitely kept a low profile. First of all, you're from Suburban Maryland. At least you went to high school, Suburban Maryland.
Yeah, Prince George's County, Maryland, just outside of DC.
Okay. What high school was that, Tim?
Friendly High School.
Went to Friendly. Oh, wow. Okay, great. And went to UVA. He was class of 86 at UVA. I remember I first met you, Tim, because I had a friend on your hall. You were an RA my first year. I can't remember which friend it was. I was trying to think.
Yeah.
But anyway, then you you played football, walked onto the football team. And then between undergrad and law school, a year you did taught at a prep school, and then worked for President Joe Biden, then Senator Joe Biden, I believe.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And then went to law school, and you were in my class, as I said before, in law school. Afterwards, you've been at several prestigious Virginia firms, Hunton and Williams, McGuire Woods. Actually, those started at Morrison and Forster. We call it MoFo. You've been at U.S. Attorney's Office as an assistant, and then also as an appointed U.S. Attorney in the Western District of Virginia. Also did some interesting things with, you wrote the report for the city of Charlottesville for the Unite the Right riot. And most recently, you were let me get this right, you were the Chief Investigative Counsel of the House Select Committee on January 6th. And you have a very interesting nonprofit to help former incarcerated folks get funds to start businesses. Did I get the broad sketches right, Tim?
It's a lot, but yeah, absolutely, Julian. All of that is correct, and happy to talk about any and all of it with you today.
Oh, great. Yeah. One thing I did forget to mention is your father-in-law is Eric Shinseki. So you did inherit the politics from your wife's side. You may have some from your own parents. We'll find out about that. But he's steeped in politics as well. First, he was the first four-star Asian American military officer, and he was Veteran Affairs among other appointments in the administration. But one thing that I'd like to ask you about, and this probably applied to General Shinseki as well, when you're on the January 6th Commission as an investigator, traditionally, I don't see those jobs as being political. You're prosecuting, like you've always been in litigation of some type. You versus them, you're just trying to make your case. Do you think those types of jobs are becoming more political over time when it makes it difficult to do a job? Or do you think this is the way it's always been?
Yeah, Julian, you're no question that doing an investigation in Congress in the midst of a really polarized process in Washington was more difficult. When I first accepted the job with the January 6th committee, the chairman of the committee, Benny Thompson from Mississippi, said, I just want you to go follow the facts and tell a credible story. And that may point the finger at some and not others. And I don't care. I just want you to conduct a unbiased, balanced investigation. And that's what we tried to do. That said, there was a lot of scrutiny and a lot of praise or criticism of what we were doing. It was inevitably took place in Congress, which is, as you said, Julian, very political. And that made it more difficult. When I was a prosecutor and it was a grand jury investigation, much more kind of behind the scenes, it was a lot easier to just sort of focus on the merits. But with the January 6th committee, we were constantly besieged with political praise or criticism or attempt to use what we were doing for one narrative or the other. And that made it more difficult. Your question about whether that's new or not is hard for me to tell. My guess is Congress has always been different than the Department of Justice in terms of the vacuum or the political context in which you work. But I will say that it was at times frustrating to try to conduct a fact-based investigation in a political context.
Yeah, and you know, with those types of roles, I mean, you're a Democrat, I believe.
Yeah.
Do you find politics entered in to these, like for example, I've always thought as prosecutors as being typically more conservative, and the liberals, or I guess we call them progressive now, more being on the public defender side of these things. So, you know, as a lawyer myself, I would prefer to have, you know, some progressives on the prosecutorial side.
Yeah.
But do you find generally that these roles as a prosecutor, they are political, and political parties do turn to dictate whether or not people go into those roles?
Less so in the criminal justice world, Julian. You know, I had the same impression when we were in law school that, you know, prosecutors were generally conservative white men and defense lawyers were more progressive and more diverse. And then I met people like Eric Holder. Eric was my first boss as a prosecutor, and he was, in the appropriate situation, every bit as aggressive or prosecutorial as anybody, but he also leavened that with mercy, or with the sense that not every single case calls for the most aggressive outcome. When I first got the job as an assistant U.S. attorney, and I got sworn in, and I sat down in Eric's office when he was the U.S. attorney in the District of Columbia at that time. He said, "I got one rule for you, and that's at all times do the right thing. And that may not always be the most aggressive or prosecutorial thing. Just trust your conscience and do what you think is right and fair. That's a higher obligation that we have as prosecutors." And I took that really seriously. So I think you're seeing now that there are plenty of progressives that are prosecutors, and then there are plenty of very conservative people that think the criminal justice world is flawed, right? So this is an issue that transcends politics a little bit. You see that with criminal justice reform. There are a lot of conservatives that very much strongly believe that we need to change criminal penalties, and we need, you know, more support for people returning from prison. So this issue doesn't cut along political lines in quite the way that other things do.
Yeah. Well, you're talking about Eric Holder talking about doing the right thing. Generally, what has motivated you in your legal career? And unlike a lot of folks, you've been a prosecutor. Right now you're a white collar defense attorney. You've been on both sides of the aisle on these type of deals. I don't know if the aisle is the right word, but what, as a prosecutor, what does motivate you? Is it the competitiveness of beating the other guy, or is it the sense of doing what's right, or justice, or is it a combination of both?
Yeah, it is definitely both. Right. So I went to law school because I wanted to have a skill that I could use to bring to bear on justice in the world. Right. Like I grew up, my father was involved in law enforcement. My mom was a teacher. I kind of had a public service orientation from the beginning, and going to law school to have the tools to navigate a system that ideally bends the world toward justice was my motivation. That said, I was an athlete growing up, as you said, and the strategy of trial and the back and forth of trial, the competitiveness, how you can argue vociferously with an opponent and then shake his or her hand when it's over. And that appeals to me as well. So it's both the sort of high-minded purpose, but it's also just fun day to day to be in situations where you are engaged in a bit of a, you know, sort of strategic contest with other lawyers.
Yeah. Well, in your work as a white collar defense attorney, do you think you would have been any different of an attorney if you would have joined Willkie Farr as a first year associate in 1991 and joined the white collar defense department and stayed there for 30 years? Have you been better served by all the different hats that you've worn? The fact that you've been on both sides, the fact that you've done commission work, the fact that you've taught, do you think that's made you a better white collar defense attorney?
Yes. Absolutely right. It's a good question, right? The fact that I now understand what prosecutors are thinking about, the issues that inform their exercise of discretion, makes me better able to serve my clients. When I was U.S. attorney, and I had been a white collar defense attorney for a little while, I was also better in that chair because I had a sense of all the collateral consequences that ensue from an investigation and the kinds of things that corporations, corporate boards, corporate legal departments evaluate. So having worked on both sides, I just have a more fulsome understanding, Julian, of sort of the pressures and the factors that operate that are not immediately obvious. Now that I've worked in Congress, I've worked in higher education, the administration, UVA, there are other contexts that I can help bring experience that I can bring to my clients. So I think every step that I've taken has broadened my perspective, and hopefully all of that I can bring to bear now in my current role.
So if you're advising a young associate at Willkie and a terrific third or fourth year working on cases with you, making tons of money, doing great, should they take that role with the government? If they're doing well, they're making a lot of money and they enjoy it, do you think it's still worth to take time out from your kind of the private practice to do other types of roles in the long run, and maybe that invests in the future?
Yeah, every situation is different, and people have unique personal, family, or financial considerations that inform this. Let's set that aside. Without those, I encourage the young people with whom I work to consider some time in government service. Right? I was a much better lawyer when I was an AUSA. Became a much better lawyer because I was given more responsibility. At a big firm, the superstar third and fourth year associates down the hall from me, the way law firms are structured, they don't get a lot of on their feet, independent experience early in their career. I went from Morrison and Forster, where I was, one member of these highly leveraged teams turning the wheels of civil litigation, to suddenly as an AUSA, having somebody's liberty essentially in my hands and working with officers and working with witnesses, putting on presentations in front of judges and juries. I had a lot more responsibility. I developed skills more quickly, and it was frankly more satisfying. So again, everybody's different, but a little bit of experience with that kind of authority, with that kind of independence, really sharpens your skills. I think the best experience for any white-collar defense attorney is the ability to see how something will look at trial. See down the road that, let's assume that this problem that you have brought to me is going to be in front of a courtroom, a jury. Here's how I think it'll go. And you don't really get that unless you've been in courtrooms and you've been in front of juries. I've had like 75 jury trials. I mean, I'm fortunate in my career, mostly as a prosecutor, that I have a sense of how things might appeal or not appeal to juries. And that is frankly the fundamental baseline of everything I do, even now, outside of the courtroom.
Is there a learning process to representing real people and also to prosecuting real people, as opposed to representing corporations when you're defending them against the white collar type actions or people within big corporations?
Yeah, really good question. Because when you're a prosecutor, there are times when you have to be careful that you don't see yourself as the lawyer for the victim. Right? Sometimes you're dealing with people that have had horrific things happen to them. They want so badly to feel restored or to feel like there's justice, and you sort of feel a bit like a crusader. But your client is not that victim, it's the broader cause of justice. And there are times where you have to let down your victim and make a decision that you think is the best one for that overall cause of justice. So you have to keep witnesses and victims as a prosecutor at arm's length. Same thing as a defense lawyer, right? The defense, you're a defense lawyer, your job is to exclusively serve the interests of your client, not what you think is best, you're not the decision maker. And it's also really stressful. Like, you have somebody's liberty in your hands and you're the defender standing between them and a jail cell or the loss of their business. You have to keep that, in my experience, to some extent, professional and not let it get too personal, because that is really risky. Corporations and white collar work, that reduces to people, right? The client may be a company, but you're really interacting with people inside that company, people who are invested in its success, people whose activities are implicated in the matter. So I don't see a huge difference between a corporate practice representing companies versus individuals, because corporations are full of individuals and you end up with those same kinds of incentives and risks when you're dealing with corporate clients.
Well, how about the kind of relationships that you form with opposing counsel? When you're a U.S. attorney, when you're a prosecutor, what kind of relationships were you able to have with the defense attorneys, especially the ones that are good at what they do? Maybe the ones that even beat you sometimes when you're surprised. And also as opposed to when you're in private practice at a firm, when typically maybe your opposing counsel is the government or so. How about the relationships?
Yeah, your credibility and the way you treat people is more important than anything else in this world. And in the relatively insular world of the criminal justice system, like when I was an AUSA in DC, I would see the same defense lawyers again and again. Some of them were at the public defender service, some of them were court appointed, got a lot of appointed work, and some were often retained as you got into more significant cases. So, and this is nothing that Eric reinforced with me. Treating people fairly and treating people with respect and dignity and courtesy has, it's not only the right thing to do, it has benefits going forward. I would have pitched arguments in front of a judge with Mark Rashawn, or with David Shurtler, or with Michelle Roberts. And then after court, we'd shake hands, and it was not personal, and there was mutual respect. And I liked that part of this. I think ironically, Julian, the criminal justice world is less personal and acrimonious than the civil world, right? I think because you're dealing every day with issues of life and death and incarceration, it isn't, for whatever reason, it isn't quite as sort of angry, and you don't have these exchanges of angry letters and accusations of bad faith. Whereas I have found more in civil litigation, some of that people are more quick to kind of make those kinds of accusations, which often troubles me. So I've enjoyed that part of the practice, the good faith ability to oppose someone else's position, but not have it get personal. When I was applying to be U.S. attorney, I got a letter of support that went to the senators from Virginia, from a guy named David Bruck, who was a capital defense lawyer. And I tried this case in Washington, a death penalty case, where my job was to argue to this jury that David's client should be executed. And despite that, nothing really more important than that, more personal than that, David and I became friends, and we would, he'd file a motion and we'd respond. And he ended up writing a letter on my behalf to be U.S. attorney. And I'm, kind of proud of that I can have good relationships with defense lawyers, even if we oppose on something as significant as a death penalty case.
Being a white collar defense attorney, and also a prosecutor, how does it affect the rest of your life? Your job is very contentious, and there's a lot riding on a lot of the things that you do. How does that affect your being a father, being a husband, or being a friend, being an athlete?
Yeah, it affects all of that. This is not a job that you put away at 5 or 6 o'clock, right? I mean, if you are in this world on either side, as a prosecutor or as a defense lawyer, when things are busy, as they usually are, they're consuming. And there are times, Julian, when I haven't been even mentally as present for the important people in my life because of being preoccupied with the case. Frankly, the last year and a half with the January 6th committee was kind of like that. It wasn't criminal, but it was so consuming, mentally and emotionally consuming, that I was not as available. And luckily, my family was very supportive and indulges my periodic absences, physically or mentally, when I get involved in these things, because they're supportive generally of me and of the importance of the work. But it's really important for lawyers to learn, how to balance, right? How to do important work that's compelling, but not at the expense of everything else. I would go for a run most evenings at 6 or 7 o'clock during the last year and a half when I was working on the January 6th thing, just because I needed the mental space for a little while, just to say, hey, I'm not available. My feet are out, on the mall. That's how I often kind of process stress. I've learned that about myself over time. Everybody needs to figure out where that space is and go there periodically so that they don't get so consumed. I think you're less effective when you're that consumed.
Yeah, I think you probably should have listened up more closely and trusted in the state's class. Maybe you would have had a much less stressful practice.
I think I was absent those days, Julian. I didn't do. Yeah, I don't know if I took trust in states because I'd be bored. I'm drawn to the high pressure stuff, but at the same time, you don't want to be too drawn that you're freezing out everything else in your life.
Exactly. Well, let's go back to how it started. You mentioned you went to Friendly. I believe you're born in Connecticut. How did you guys first arrive to Prince George's County?
My dad, as I said, was in law enforcement. He worked for the New York City Police Department as a civilian aide to the then chief of the New York City Police Department, and then Patrick Murphy. And then Patrick Murphy became head of this thing called the Police Foundation, which is a grant-making organization that helps police departments improve processes. And that was in Washington. So that's what moved us from Connecticut, where we live, down to Maryland. And I lived in PG County at a time when we first moved there, when it was largely white and largely rural. And by the time I was in high school, I graduated from high school in 1982, the county was really changing demographically. And I happened to catch it when it was 50-50. My high school was 52% white and 48% black. So I had a rare moment in America to go to a truly integrated school where there was not essentially a large majority and a small minority, but kind of a lot of people that were playing sports together or going to class together. And that was hugely formative for me. Right? Again, it doesn't happen enough in America. So I was fortunate that I went to a place that was truly integrated. And so much of what I've done since then is a product of that.
Yeah, I believe Friendly is kind of like in a north East Silver Spring type area, kind of like that going towards
more South PG County, sort of just straight out from like out Indian Head Highway from straight down towards Fort Washington Park.
Oh, got it. Yeah. I'm way off. Yeah. So how did you get started in sports and football?
Ever since I was a little kid, I loved sports. My family was all into sports. I started playing youth football, youth baseball, youth basketball. And then I got to Friendly, and we were, it was a really strong program. And I, aspired to wear that uniform from the time I was a little kid. And fortunately, by the time I got to high school, I was a quarterback of my high school football team. We were the #1 team in the DC area for a little while. We were undefeated throughout the regular season of both my junior and senior years. Unfortunately, lost in the state championship game both years to the same team, the Springbrook Blue Devils from Montgomery County. It was a big deal in my high school. Like Friday nights, where everybody came and the stadium was full. So I was a part of that culture and enjoyed it, loved it, got a lot out of it, and thankfully we were pretty successful.
Who was your first role model as quarterback? I guess growing up in DC in the 70s, maybe Sonny Jurgensen or Billy Kilmer.
Yeah. I was a Redskin fan from the time I was a kid. I was a huge Kilmer Jurgensen fan. I became a Joe Theismann fan. I was a hometown guy. But I was also a baseball and a basketball fan too. I was a big Cal Ripken fan, an Orioles fan growing up. I was a Washington Bullets fan. I loved Wes Unseld and Elvin Hayes and those teams in the 70s that were really good. I was a DC sports guy all the way because that was my formative years, was watching those guys.
Well, a lot of the athletes that I talk to, probably the most important person in their lives other than their parents or a coach that they had somewhere along the way. How about you? Who were your influential coaches that formed you?
Yeah, I had a lot of great coaches. Our high school football coach was a guy named Jim Crawford, who was extremely successful, gruff and not very approachable, but held us to a really high standard. And the high standard applied on and off the field, right? I knew that as a leader on that team, that the expectations extended beyond that stadium on Friday nights and carried through my time in the school day and beyond. So I grew up seeing the privilege of being an athlete and wearing a uniform comes with responsibility. And you got to carry yourself, if you want that kind of attention and that kind of privilege, with that comes the responsibility to do the right thing. And Coach Crawford was part of the reason for that.
Yeah. What were the race relations like at Friendly?
Good, Julian. Athletics has always been a place that is much better when it comes to race relations, because you take the focus away from race and you put it on this external thing that everybody shares, right? We want to win. We want to win a championship. So the fact that we may live in a different neighborhood or we have our skin color is different is less important than that overall goal. But it was beyond that. It was just, again, I was in a school that had true interaction and integration, because like when we were at UVA, 90% white and 10% black. That is a very different dynamic. The 10%, is closer in part because their experience isn't necessarily the same as the 90%. And the 90% doesn't necessarily have the same opportunity to get to know and to learn from and interact with the 10%. When it's 52-48, everybody is interacting all the time. And that just made it a relatively harmonious place. I don't recall in my high school experience racial problems, racial tension, nothing like that. I'm sure there were on the individual level there were, but it was not a systemic thing that infected my high school experience, thankfully.
Well, how did you perceive the race relations when you first came to UVA? So I went to Robinson and Fairfax, and Robinson was 96% white, probably 4% black, but maybe other 1% Asian or but mostly white. You know, it was a progressive, I guess we'd probably call it liberal back then. We didn't really think about race that much. I mean, most of my closest friends were black because they were on the basketball team or whatever. But I had plenty of white friends. I didn't think about race. I thought about race every single day I was in Charlottesville. It was a big change for me. How did you perceive the race relations, especially when you first came to UVA?
Yeah, it is an insightful point, and I had the same experience. So my roommate when I was first year at UVA was a guy named Elliot Hare, who was a football teammate of mine. You remember Elliot?
Yeah.
Black student at UVA, and he immediately, from day one on grounds, is getting sort of sucked into institutionalized separatism, where a lot of older black students are coming around. He went online, he pledged Kappa Alpha Psi, and his life at the university became relatively racially exclusive. Whereas I was going, to Rugby Road, or I was also sucked into this institutionalized separatism. So Elliot and I together formed this organization called Students Together Against Racial Separatism, STARS. And we would get people together in dorm lounges just to talk about this phenomenon, the fact that the university structure seemed to funnel us into these different places because it struck us as different from what we had experienced in high school. So back then, you were there, Julian, in the early 80s, a lot of well-intentioned people, but not a lot of genuine interaction. UVA was not very racially progressive, didn't do a good enough job bringing in a larger number of first-generation students, students of color, students that had a non-traditional background. And as a result, those that did come with that background kind of huddled together, and that was not good for them or good for the broader group. And we thought that was a problem, and we wanted to change it. So we started that organization.
You know what's interesting is my son. You told me that your son is at UVA, and my son's a first year at UVA. And he's actually mixed. And when he went to UVA, if you saw him, you wouldn't necessarily know. He doesn't necessarily appear African American at first blush. But when he went down there, he shaved his head, got his earring. He goes out of his way to appear black. And I thought that's the way it was when I was in school. Because when I was in school, all my friends at UVA, all my friends were black. When I walked down the street, I'd only see the black faces, and just because of the social segregation that you talked about. We had different parties. I didn't feel welcome at some places at Rugby Road. My only really good friend was a guy named Phil Nichols, who you may know, good basketball
player. Phil. Yeah.
He's my only probably really good friend, besides my high school guys that I probably knew a little bit from high school. And my son is in the same situation. And it's interesting because UVA is probably 49% white. Now it's probably 25% Asian mixed, or Indian Asian. So it's still that way. The minorities are still separating themselves socially.
Yeah, I think for black students in particular, when it's 7% or 8% or 9%, you stick out. And there is still, unfortunately, some assumptions or stereotypes about that black students correctly perceive coming at them. And as a result, they find each other, right? When you're a freshman in college, you're immediately looking for identity or something to latch onto that sort of makes this big, intimidating place smaller. And unfortunately, when you have a small racial minority group, that becomes the easiest and first thing and I don't mean to suggest that it's wrong, but it is a missed opportunity, right? When I was working at UVA, Julian, we talked a lot about how the university doesn't do a good enough job capturing the educational benefits of diversity, right? We try really hard to have a diverse class. We throw everybody together in the first year dorms where your roommate or who's on your hall beyond your control. Then all of a sudden, second year, people go off into their respective directions, their affinity groups, their fraternities and sororities, and diversity as a value is much less institutionalized. That's in part what has informed the administration's decision to now make it first and second year mandatory living on grounds, because again, I want to take more advantage of the diversity that we work very hard to achieve among the student body, instead of having people taste it a little bit, but then go off in every direction. The only way this really changes is critical mass. You just need more people in different groups so that they are not exclusively in these small pockets, but are having a lot more interaction with people that are different.
Well, I want to get back to some of the race aspects of UVA when we talk about the Unite the Right rally, but I want to go to your football at UVA. So you end up walking onto the football team.
I did,
what was that process?
Yes, George Welsh was the coach. It was his first year at UVA, and I just had such a good experience in high school that I decided to walk on. So we sent them like a VHS tape. Like I had a little reel from high school, and they said, "Sure, you can walk on." I was not like a scholarship athlete, but they had space for me. So I played my first year. I was the scout team quarterback. Every week I would be pretending to be Boomer Esiason or Warren Moon, right? Like I was this kind of tackling dummy of sorts, running that week's opponent's offense against the first team defense. And Jerry Capone would hold up these cards with the play for us on the scout team, and we would all look at what we were going to do. Then we go run the play against the defense. And you know what happened, Julian, was I love football, but it was like a job. It was not the same as it had been in high school. I was missing a lot of other things at the university, other opportunities that I wanted to take advantage of. So the exclusivity of it and the fact that I was, not exactly part of the plans for Coach Welsh's, building a foundation going forward, I stopped after my first year. So it was important to me to feel like I could do, but it was not so important to me that I was willing to give up. There was an opportunity cost. All the other stuff I was missing, that's why I stopped.
Where did you find your groove at UVA? Where were you? I know you're an RA, so where did you finally find your people and felt the most comfortable?
Yeah, I was an RA. I did end up rushing and pledging a fraternity. I got really I was a little nerdy English major and wrote a lot of papers and read a lot. I had a really balanced and really positive experience at UVA. I could play basketball most afternoons. I could read, the classics. I met a lot of smart people. I had a lot of fun. That public service is probably what drew me to being an RA, right? I wanted to help encourage younger, I lived in the first year dorms for my third and my fourth year, helping people adjust to the university, helping them find their people. That was very satisfying for me. So I had a really well-rounded place. I worked hard and play hard, just like the UVA ethic. It worked for me. I wouldn't do it any differently if I had college to do over again.
So Tim, what dorm were you RA fall of '84? Because I had a friend that was on your hall, but I can't. Maybe it was AJ Alego, but I don't.
AJ was in my fraternity. He was Sigma Chi. I was in Humphreys my third year, and then I was co-chair of the program my fourth year. So I lived in the Dabney suite.
Okay, that's great. Well, look, so you end up after undergrad. Did you know you were going to go to law school? I know you took a couple of years. You taught at a prep school and you worked for Joe Biden. But did you know you were going to eventually get to law school?
Yeah, I applied as a fourth year undergrad and then deferred. So I knew I wanted to go to law school, but I didn't want to go right away. So luckily, UVA, I'm not sure if it's still this way, but they were very accommodating. So once I got accepted, they twice said, sure, you can put it off another year and we'll hold your spot. So my first year, I started actually volunteering for my first year I was teaching. So I taught high school English at Archbishop Carroll High School. I coached a little bit of football and baseball. And then I needed a job for the summer after I taught. So I volunteered on then Senator Biden's presidential campaign. That's where I met my wife. And then the campaign ended in September, and I moved into a job on his Senate staff, essentially answering constituent mail. So I had a great experience teaching, immense respect for teachers. I did it, Julian, because I thought it would be interesting, but it actually is quite practical in terms of building the skills that I would use as a trial lawyer. You're standing in front of people trying to get them to listen to you, pay attention. You're trying to be persuasive. As a teacher, it's the same thing you're doing as a trial lawyer. I also had students that had a very different life experience than mine. Right? I had students that were parents at 15, 16 years old. The school where I taught was 98% Black, all boys, run by the Archdiocese, and over half of the students were on full financial aid. So it was a school where usually parents or single parent wanted something a little better for their son than a DC public school, so they send them to Carroll. So I learned a lot from my students about their lives and how different their lives were from my sort of, relatively cloistered suburban life. And teaching them the appreciation of the written word and literature was fascinating. And then coaching, man, I got a chance to coach football, and I was the head coach for the JV baseball team for some kids that had never played baseball before. That was really fun and interesting. So I had a great experience teaching. And Hill, it was great to do for a year, but it was enough for me to know I didn't want to do that, right? Be a Hill staffer. So I'm back. I did go to law school after those 2 years out.
Yeah. If somebody would have told you at the time that Joe Biden would be president today, what would you have said?
I mean, he dropped out, right? So when I was working for him, he had exaggerated his academic record. He had used some speech quotes from a British politician without attribution. I, like everyone else, assumed that he'd go back to the Senate and he'd be effective. Delaware was, pretty safe that he could stay there indefinitely, but not that he would ever be president. I think when somebody decides that they can be president or that they should be, it's hard to ever let that go. So I guess I shouldn't be too surprised that, many years later, that was still in his head and that he decided to do it. He's an incredibly charismatic person with a big heart. I have a lot of respect for President Biden. I did at the time. I'm glad he's where he is. I think he's doing a great job, but I would not have expected it back when he dropped out of the campaign in the summer of '87. He didn't even make it to '88. He dropped out in the fall of '87.
Yeah. And one day, Tim Clyburn decided he should be president, and here he is.
Exactly.
So, let's talk about law school. What are your memories of law school? To me, I think I kind of idealize it. It's like this wonderful time and interesting people, interesting classes, fun parties. Obviously, it was a lot more than that. But how about you? What are your memories of UVA Law?
Yeah, similarly, I had 2 years off, so I was kind of ready to get more serious. I'm glad that I took those couple of years between, and I generally encourage people to think about law school, do a little something else first and be sure that you want to go. So I was sure that I wanted to go. I was immediately drawn to the criminal justice world because, again, I wanted to do something that was impactful. I had this public service background I had taught. So I kind of took all of the criminal law, constitutional law, and clinic stuff. Like I did moot court and I did a criminal defense clinic. So I really wanted to make it practical. Again, like undergrad, work hard, play hard. I studied a lot, but not at the expense of having really good friends and continuing to play flag football or play hoops up at North Grounds. Or, I had a really positive and balanced experience in law school. Yeah, glad that I chose UVA, but also glad that I had the buffer between the two.
Yeah. Well, you're a lecturer at UVA Law. I think I believe you're still doing that. Yeah. How has the law school changed over the years?
Yeah, it's smaller. As there have been fewer people going to law school, it's shrunk a little bit.
Oh, is that right? I didn't know that.
Yeah, there are only like 2 fewer sections, small sections now than there were when we were there.
Interesting.
It to be a really intellectually alive place. I'm teaching a class now called Law and Riots. It's about the intersection of free speech and public safety and how governments have to simultaneously protect both values, and that can be difficult to do in instances like the Charlottesville 2017 events or January 6th. And my students are generally third years who are ready for something, it's a small seminar, who are ready for something a little more specialized. So I don't necessarily get them when they're first year, and I get a small segment once I do this one semester per year. But I've totally enjoyed it, and I think the quality of the discourse and the writing and the participation continues to be really strong. My class is actually pretty diverse ideologically, which I'm glad about. I was worried that this class would attract kind of exclusively anti-racist activists who have participated in protests. We have some people that are bring that perspective, but we also have some people that are sort of pro-law enforcement and have different views, and they have thus far shown the ability to disagree in a constructive way, which I worry about across higher education. I worry about it at UVA. I think we need to maintain spaces where people can disagree without fear that what they say is going to get them canceled or get them criticized unfairly. The law school seems to do a pretty good job of encouraging, creating a climate in which you can disagree constructively.
Well, when we went to law school, we were on the tail end of the Reagan years and during the George H.W. Bush years. Law schools were conservative back then. They were, I would say, they were majority conservative. At least I felt that way. I understand that they're no longer like that. I understand that like UVA Law is a more progressive place now.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think when you look at the faculty as well, a lot of the younger faculty seem to be much more progressive. I know in terms of the criminal justice faculty, the ones that I know the most, they're absolutely very writing about, bail reform and writing about sentencing reform and are much more focused on flaws in the system. So I think UVA has also prioritized public service, right? There's a public service program and a public service center and more clinics. When we were there, I think there are like 3 clinics. Now there's like 12.
Wow.
So I think the law school's marketing itself in part on this public service model, and that I think attracts maybe more progressive students. So you're right, Julian. I do recall it feeling like a relatively conservative place. I think now people would probably say it's a more liberal place, but I hope that doesn't mean that conservative views are not welcome. They should be, and they ought to be. There ought to be a space where we can air things in an open-minded way without being personalized or judged.
Yeah, it looks like I was born 30 years too early, or went to law school 30 years too early.
Yeah.
So look, you end up practicing, going to work at Morrison and Forster, I believe a California-based firm. Yeah. A great firm, interesting for any firm with a nickname Mofo is an interesting place. But talk about being a young lawyer. What was it like to be a young lawyer then, and have things changed at all?
Yeah, so I went to San Francisco because my wife was in graduate school in the Bay Area, so I needed to work in the Bay Area, and I hated being a young associate. Right, my office was on the 35th floor of this big office building in San Francisco, and I remember looking out my window down at the street, and I would see, ant-like people walking around and feeling like that's perfectly emblematic of the distance between my degree and impact around real life. Like I'm up here, dealing with civil litigation on behalf of company X who's suing company Y, when there are real people down there, but I'm just distant from that. So I didn't like being a young associate at a big firm. I didn't feel good at it. I didn't feel like I was given much responsibility. And I really had gone to law school wanting to try cases, wanting to be in the criminal justice world. So when Lori finished her program, her graduate program, that then we no longer needed to be in the Bay Area. That's when I started looking at both public defender and prosecutor jobs. And that's when Eric Holder hired me and we moved back to DC. And I became an AUSA only after a couple of years at a law firm.
Yeah. Well, you've been at a few different firms, and I mean, all of them great firms. Are the culture at firms very similar? I mean, I'm sure when you go there, they tell you we're different, lifestyle, it's great here. It's going to be great. You're going to make tons of money. It's going to be fun. But in reality, are law firms all about the same, or do they really differ in their culture?
Yes and no, right? There are certain commonalities with everyone, right? Every firm will talk about their culture and their commitment to pro bono and their collegial nature. But look, every firm is a profit center. And the bottom line, the real currency is hours when you're an associate and business development when you're a partner. That's the same at Mofo, at McGuire Woods, at Hunton, and now at Willkie. So everything else is kind of, window dressing because they all want to make money. And if you are productive and successful, you're going to be fine no matter what. That said, there certainly are cultural differences. There's formal, informal, right? At Hunton, where I worked, where I led the white collar practice, every email that you sent around started with "pardon the interruption." And people would walk around with their jackets on, like they'd go up to the dining room and they'd have their suit coat on. It's just a more formal place, whereas McGuire Woods was a lot more informal. That just, those things tend to reinforce themselves. When a culture is more formal, it's going to attract people that like that and carry themselves that way. And the same thing happens more informal. Willkie, where I am now, where I'm just getting used to, is a New York-based firm, and that's a different culture, right? It's different in terms of the time when people are busy, right? In the mornings, less so, but in the evening more so. That's a New York thing. It's a heavy transactional practice that feeds a lot of investigations and white collar work, but the bread and butter of the firm is on the deal side. And that is a different culture than what I was used to with the Virginia firms. My choices have been largely informed by my family and my personal life. MoFo, I need to live in San Francisco. Woods and Hunting. I had young kids and I live in Charlottesville and I wanted to be in Virginia. Two of my kids are in college now, and I'm in largely a Washington practice because I don't have the same need to be, in Virginia anymore. So I have chosen these places based in part on culture, but really more on personal things going on in my own life.
You mentioned Hunting, and pardon the interruption. Did they still wear the white wigs and the knickers when you were at Hunting?
I didn't see the white wigs. They may have been in the closet. No, they don't look that formal. It's pretty formal, Julia, but we can go with the knickers. No, okay. I didn't see that.
Yeah. Well, how about what is the life of a lawyer in a smaller market like Charlottesville? Huge firm, but a smaller market. Is it different, the practice of law in the smaller markets, mid-sized markets, than it is in San Francisco and New York?
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. Look, I have tried for most of my career to have a big city practice and a small town life, and that's a hard balance to maintain. It means that you have to move around a lot. I've had to travel a lot, whether it's driving and now getting on airplanes. Lawyers who practice in Charlottesville are generally generalists, right? If you're in a small bar, then you're going to one day do a civil matter, one day do criminal defense, the next day, you might be working on a divorce matter. Like, there are a lot of really good lawyers that are generalists, and that's one model that's attractive. Like, you can be a sort of a community problem solver, whereas, as bigger firm lawyers want you to specialize, and everybody sort of has a niche. And the more senior you get, your niche becomes even more pronounced. I'm a white collar defense and investigations lawyer. Luckily, that's pretty broad as law firm specialties go, because it could be in lots of different industries, lots of different predicates in terms of what causes the investigation. But small town, generally broader based, more diverse practice versus much more specialty in the big city.
Well, getting back to Charlottesville, Charlottesville has had a rough run of things, and it doesn't necessarily involve the school. But with Martise Johnson in 2015, the victim of the police brutality.
Martise is a Willkie associate. He works here.
Is that right?
Yeah, he's a New York real estate lawyer in New York. That seems like not that long ago, but he went to Michigan Law School, and he is now a second-year associate in our New York office.
What a great story. Yeah, I had no idea. Yeah, but that's awesome. Well, for those who forgot, Martise was flipped over by a policeman at what we call the corner, which is the main strip of bars near campus. And it was national news. And then obviously the Unite the Right riot. Is my sense is, and as a father who sent their son to UVA, some of this was luck of the draw in that there's racism everywhere, but a lot of these incidents are just part of the racism in society. Yeah. And like the Unite the Right was, probably caused more by rabble rousers elsewhere. They picked Charlottesville as a place, or maybe there's a hub there somewhere. But do these things have anything to do with the university, or this is just kind of some of the racist things that we're dealing with society in general?
Yeah, I think unfortunately there is a hook to the university. So the two men who organized the Unite the Right rally are UVA graduates, Richard Spencer and Jason Kessler. Both went to UVA. And the original impetus for the Unite the Right rally was the statues, the Civil War statues. So Charlottesville for years had Robert E. Lee in a town square and Stonewall Jackson in a different town square. And the city council, before, back in 2014, 15, just started talking about whether they should remove those statues. So Charlottesville was sort of ahead of the curve when it came to this issue of Civil War iconography. And the city decided to take the statues down because there were a lot of people that were offended by those sort of badges of white supremacy. And Richard Spencer and Jason Kessler, because of the statue discussion, decided to use that as the impetus to bring together lots of white nationalist groups. So in UVA is sort of a badge of history with Thomas Jefferson, who was a slave owner as its founder. sort of was a magnet for a lot of people on both sides to come to that forum to have this discussion. So I don't want to say UVA is, any different than any other, institution that goes back many years, but I can't say it's totally disconnected for why we had the Unite the Right rally. I think in part, it attracted more people on both sides because of its history.
Right. Yeah. Well, then you became university counsel, and I guess that's also the assistant attorney general for the state. It's part of the same job, I believe. Tell us a little bit about that role.
Yeah, so I went to law school with Jim Ryan. We both did. Jim was in the class of '92, and when he was appointed president of the university, he reached out to me. I was at Hunton and Williams at the time, and he asked me to be part of his leadership team. The current general counsel was retiring, so there was some space. And as a weird, anachronistic vestige of Virginia law, the state attorney general represents all state agencies, and that means hires the general counsel for all of the public universities. So Mark Herring, who was the attorney general at the time, at Jim Ryan's instigation, hired me to be UVA's counsel. And I did that for 3.5 years. I had a great experience working with President Ryan and the team there. I love UVA. I went there twice. I have a son who's now 4th year there. So, and I live a mile from Madison Hall. So like in terms of balance between my family and my job, it was ideal. And it was new. Like I didn't know a lot about higher education. I didn't know a lot about NCAA stuff. I didn't know a lot about the sort of free speech and academic freedom issues that arise. So intellectually, it was really fascinating. And I had a staff of 10 lawyers, all of whom had specialties that I supervised. So when I took the January 6th job, it was as a leave of absence. I was going to do it for a year or so and then come back to UVA. But there was an election, and the new Attorney General of Virginia, Jason Miyares, Republican, terminated my leave of absence. No explanation, no warning. It was literally the day before he was inaugurated. And I never got any answer as to why. And President Ryan and the board, vociferously objected and pushed back. And he just said, it's my call, and I want to put my own person in place at UVA. I can't help but assume that there's some political motivation for that, given that I was leading this investigation that was pointing a finger at former President Trump. So I was really frustrated with that. But by law, it is the Attorney General's prerogative. I think that needs to change, Julian. I think it is just an inherent conflict that a multi-billion-dollar enterprise like a university cannot hire its own lawyer and have a lawyer who's solely loyal to the organization, as opposed to Richmond. There are times when Richmond doesn't agree with the university, and the university doesn't have its own independent counsel, which to me is shocking and unusual around the country. So there has been some talk of legislative change to pull the university counsel out of the AG's office, or at least give the university president and board the ability to hire and fire their own lawyer. I support that because I think, separate from my situation, it's just better policy to have independent counsel advising universities.
For folks, folks like me who are concerned about diversity at the university, and also concerned about issues of guns around students with the shooting of the students, football students at UVA this November. Do we have reason to be concerned about Governor Youngkin and the folks that he can appoint? I mean, are these the kind of, you hope that these things are just, you hear them on TV, and that in reality, good people will make the right decisions and the right thing will be done. Do we have reasons to be concerned about folks that Governor Youngkin can appoint?
Yeah, I mean, look, we've already seen that. Governor Youngkin has appointed 4 people to the Board of Visitors at UVA. And just in the last week, we've seen some text messages from one of them talking about returning UVA to its glory days, criticizing the administration, criticizing President Ryan and others at the administration, a resistance to the sort of progressive vision that Jim and the board have wanted to implement. They want to be the best public university and train public servants and community citizens. And I think there are a lot of people that want the university to go back to the good old days, which really weren't that good for lots of people, particularly people of color and first generation students who couldn't even get in. I think I'm worried about Governor Youngkin trying to move the university in a direction ideologically. I'm also worried about what's going to happen with the Supreme Court. I think there's a really good chance soon that the court will say universities can no longer consider race in admissions, and that will make it harder to achieve diversity among student bodies. This has happened by referendum in certain states, in California and in Michigan. Number of Black students has dropped precipitously. Right now, it's race is one factor among many in a holistic process, but if you have to take race out of it, the university is going to have to come up with some other ways to identify, truly diverse perspectives and diverse backgrounds, and that's going to be harder to do. And my hope my fear is that it will reduce the diversity that we work very hard to achieve.
Well, look, Tim, this has been great talking to you. You've had such a great career. I've been able to follow some of it, and just amazing achievements. Glad to have gone to law school with you. And look, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me. Maybe at some point, I'm in Arlington. If you, I don't know if you're remote or whatever, but if you ever want to, grab lunch or coffee or something.
I'm in DC about half the time. I'm here, couple, 2-3 nights a week. So we should definitely get together. It'd be good to do this in person in Arlington or in DC as opposed to over screen. I really appreciate the invitation. Thanks and I love the podcast. I hope you continue to get voices because you ask good questions and you bring people out. It's a rare quality.
Oh, well, I appreciate the comment. I really enjoy it. I love hearing stories about successful people and how they get there. I find it fascinating, especially because I was able to watch your career from afar when you were an RA. I knew who you were, and then in law school, I don't think we knew each other that well, but I definitely knew we probably knew each other, but not knew each other that well.
I think we played a little basketball together at times as well.
Yeah, exactly right. So
yeah.
Well, anyway, Tim, look, thanks. I took probably more of your time than you promised, but I really appreciate you doing this.
My pleasure, Julian. Thanks very much. Good luck.
All right, Tim, have a great day. All right.
I'm helpless when I'm ocean waves.